Hi everyone, this lecture has to do with collecting quantitative data. I'm going to be dealing with issues of sampling and questionnaires and supplements. So in terms of questionnaires, the reason we refer to questionnaires here is because it doesn't matter if you are conducting a survey or an experiment, a questionnaire is the piece of paper or the instrument that is used in order to collate respondent data on. So they need to be prepared, and there's only get one chance of collecting the data, so you need to make sure that your sampling is correct and that your questionnaires and your supplements work effectively. So this relates to chapters 10 and 12 of your textbook. So, as I've already said, I'll first deal with sampling, then I'll look at questionnaires and some of the practicalities of their design and their construction. And then I will talk about the supplements that go along with the questionnaire that are used to both attract people to take part in a study and also provide instructions for people collating data or collecting data, and also instructions for people who then need to input data that will later be analysed. So these topics relate to two of our learning outcomes. They relate to retrieving primary quantitative data to solve a marketing problem, and it also relates to establishing the methodological quality, reliability and validity of the data collected. Because in sampling and in the questionnaire design is where quantitative data can be viewed as both reliable and valid. So sampling. So the reason we discuss sampling here is that for most consumer studies, it is too hard to talk to the entire population. So we need to decide who and how are we going to access people within a particular population to ask them the questions that we need answered. And sampling itself creates its own bias in the data collection process. So as this cartoon demonstrates, you have three different samples taken, and the answer depends on who is actually asked. So if you're sampling people who listen to the National Public Radio Service in the US, you're likely to get a sample of people who dislike Donald Trump. And if you look at a Bernie Sanders fan fiction headquarters, you're likely to get someone who loves Bernie Sanders. However, if you're just going to do a random phone survey of regular householders, as in the third cell of the cartoon, you are likely to get people who are so disinterested in politics that they are unlikely to actually participate. So here we have selection bias and non-participation bias both demonstrated. So sampling itself, and in terms of its validity, it relates very much to the external validity of a study. So in effective sampling, what we need to achieve is the ability to generalize the findings from your study to the population in general. So how do we then decide how to sample a particular subset of a population? Well, this is the difference between a sample versus a census. So the sample is a proportion of the population, whereas a census is the population itself. It is a survey of that population. So examples are a sample that for a marketing research project might sample 200 people who happen to purchase Coca-Cola in the last 2 weeks. Whereas a census would have to sample everyone who's ever drunk Coca-Cola in the last 2 weeks. A sample often is predetermined in terms of the target sample, because the larger the sample, the larger the costs involved in gathering the data. So the questions that you need to ask yourself in taking a sample or choosing to do a sample is, should a sample be taken? Is the population large enough and difficult enough to access as a whole that a sample is the best option? What process should be followed in selecting a sample? So should we be going for a random sample or a convenient sample? Should we be trying to access them via telephone, the internet, mobile phones, waylaying them in the streets? Sorry, that's called a mall intercept. So there's some practical implications there. What type of sample is most effective? So if you're getting difficult to reach populations, possibly a convenience or a non-probabilistic sampling technique like convenience sampling or snowball sampling is the most effective. Because if you can access one person who has a certain attribute that is difficult to find, that person may know others that they can then suggest that you talk to. Whereas if you're trying to establish the generalizability to a population, and that population itself is relatively easy to access, but a sample is cheaper, then a probabilistic sampling technique is probably more effective. How large should the sample be? The larger the sample, the more likely that biases and errors are to be reduced. However, in increasing the sample size, you are increasing your costs in terms of money and time just to start with. And what can be done to control for errors? So do we need to have some sort of quota system in order to control for errors that might occur in random sampling? As you can see in the cartoon onto the right, random sampling doesn't necessarily mean that you get a representative sample. So, things to consider in terms of choosing a sample versus a census. So, in terms of a whole population, budgets are very large. So, in the Australian plebiscite to ascertain people's opinions around the same-sex marriage vote, it costs, was it $11 million or $17 million to basically take a census of the Australian population that was eligible to vote, so everyone over 18. Whereas if you simply needed to get 200 people's opinion on same-sex marriage, that is a smaller sample and therefore the budget is smaller. How much time do you have available? Sampling can take quite short time periods. If you have a small sample and you have a large pool of participants available on the internet, you can sample effectively in 2 to 3 days. However, to take a census to get access to everyone who's in a population, takes quite a long time. As in the same-sex marriage survey that we did in Australia last year, took a few months to collect all of that data. The population size. It is effective to sample when the population size is large. If it's large, it's impossible to get hold of everyone effectively, so a sample is more appropriate. Whereas if the population size is actually small, a census might be more appropriate. We have variance in the characteristics, so the differences between people within the population. So if the variance in people who drink Coca-Cola is actually small within the larger population, then a sample is appropriate. However, if the variance in the characteristics of people at a population level is there's large differences between people. A census is more appropriate in order to try and get the opinions of everyone who has those varying characteristics. The costs of sampling errors. So how much can we afford if we are wrong? We talk about type 1 versus type 2 errors when it comes to quantitative. And sampling can increase these errors between accepting a hypothesis that are not true versus rejecting hypotheses that are true. So in terms of marketing, most of the costs of sampling errors are relatively low compared to the costs of implementing the surveys themselves. Whereas in census type of situations, cost of sampling errors could be the difference between life and death if you're talking about medical research. So the cost of non-sampling errors. So other errors that can be incorporated in, that are included in the study, things like construct measurement errors. Those might have higher costs attached to them than sampling errors, whereas these are reversed in the census situation. The nature of the measurement, destructive versus non-destructive. So by destructive, what we mean is that by measuring the population, essentially we are destroying what it is that we are measuring. For example, if you are to ask someone their opinion, you are automatically making the topic on which you are asking them about more salient to the respondent, meaning that going back and asking them the same question again means that because the opinion has become more salient, that opinion becomes biased because of that salience. So in marketing research, we tend to look for sampling because we can't measure the same people twice. Whereas in a census, there is less of this kind of bias created by the measurement process, is what we call non-destructive. So you can go back and ask the same person the same thing over and over and over again without influencing the answer that you get. And lastly, if you're actually interested in individual cases versus populations themselves. So in marketing research, we're often interested in individual cases and also in this idea of building segments. So we're looking at creating groups of people as individuals who belong together, whereas a census tends to be about getting broad overall opinions on a topic rather than trying to group different sets of opinions together. So in deciding on your sampling plan, we have 5 different stages. You need to define what the population is, determine the sampling frame that you will use, select your sampling technique, either probabilistic or non-probabilistic, determine the sample size of those that you will contact versus your target for your final sample size before you will say you have sufficient responses to conduct the study. And finally, you need to execute the sampling process. So essentially, recruit people into your study. So defining the target population, we talk about 4 different characteristics here. The element is the object about which or from which the information is desired. So an element might be a user of a particular product. It could be someone who has seen a particular advertisement in order to ask their opinion on that piece of advertising. So what is it that you're actually interested in? The sampling unit, like the unit of analysis, is at what level is the data going to be aggregated? So for most marketing research, the sampling unit is individuals. So we will ask individual consumers their opinions. However, in some cases, particularly in things like grocery products, the unit of analysis or the sampling unit might actually be households. So I have been involved in studies involving things like hair removal products and breakfast cereal, where the sampling unit has been both parent and child together, who live together within the same household, because the assumption is there that the parent will do the grocery shopping while the child is the one who is using the actual product and might be influencing the choice of the parent. So the next issue that needs to be addressed in defining the target population is the extent. This is drawing geographical boundaries around the population of interest. So the geographical boundaries might be whole countries, they might be just particular, they might be small suburbs within cities. It's a matter of who are you particularly interested in and where are they located. And finally, the time. What period is under consideration? This is particularly of importance in doing things like advertising effectiveness surveys. So an advertisement campaign when launched, they have various time periods in which that they wish to see results. And the results that they wish to see differ by the time period under consideration. So within the first week of an advertising campaign being launched, a sample of people who might have seen that advertisement needs to be taken, and we are looking for basically awareness of the advertising campaign. Then after maybe 3 months, we might take another sample of the population to see if any preference has been influenced by that advertising campaign, and maybe after say 6 months another sample would be taken to consider, have people actually been influenced to purchase the product based on that advertising campaign. So time has a particular purpose here about when are you going to take this sample, and also time also relates to how long are you going to leave the study open in order to recruit people into your sample. Because in most studies, the response, if people are going to respond, it will happen very soon after the launch of a survey, and then it very quickly trickles off. So, in terms of choosing sample design, the sampling design or the sampling frame, sampling design, sampling frame, sample size, all of these decisions that need to be made, there are a number of different factors to be taken into account. So how important is this decision to the central business functions of the firm? Is this something that will basically change the course of the business, make it profitable or not? So in those sorts of situations, even though it might be expensive to take a larger sample, in order to reduce the likelihood of error, it might be in the firm's best interest to increase the sample size. The nature of the research itself. So for things like experiments, the sample sizes tend to be smaller, particularly if you are dealing with an experiment that requires people to be physically present. It's more difficult to get people into a particular location, so the nature of that type of research tends to result in a smaller sampling size. The number of variables in your questionnaire, so the number of ideas that you are trying to test. So these are concepts and theories that I talked about in the last lecture. So in terms of what happens here is the higher the number of variables you include in your questionnaire, the larger the sample size you require. Within statistics, certain types of statistics require a certain level of what is called degrees of freedom. And sample size provides you with a larger capacity to have this enough degrees of freedom to include more variables in your consideration in the analysis. So the nature of the analysis, what kind of tests are going to be run? Certain statistics require you to have a sample within each type of category that you are trying to test. Some types of statistics only work in sample sizes above 30. So in terms of the nature of the analysis or the test that you need to run, some of that dictates the sample size. So you have sufficient numbers of respondents in order to run the appropriate tests. Often people use similar studies as a guideline for their sample sizes. So product testing studies will tend to use maybe 200 to 300. If you do these tests all the time and you know that you get reasonable results from studies you've run in the past, then you can just rely on past experience. Incidence rates. Basically, how many people are going to be excluded from your sampling or your final sample based on accessing that the incidence of a certain characteristic appearing in the population. For example, if you are looking for left-handed footballers who were born on Mondays, your incidence rates within the population might be quite small. So therefore, you need to access a large number of people in order to get a reasonable sample size of respondents to fit within your sampling frame or your final sample. And the more people that you have to contact and that are excluded because they do not fulfill the characteristics of the object that you are interested in, the more expensive it becomes, because you still have to pay to contact people even though they don't meet the criteria. Completion rates are always a problem. Certain types of survey methods have extremely low completion rates. So there is two different types of rates that go on here. So in things like online research, if you just have a banner ad or a pop-up ad, the likelihood of someone actually clicking on your survey to start completing it is about 0.01%. So therefore, if you need to get 1,000 people to complete your survey, you need to get something like 100,000 people to actually view the pop-up window that your survey might appear in. On the other hand, you have completion rates. This is the number of people who, after they click on or start a survey, actually complete it to the end. The longer the survey, the longer the questionnaire, the higher the dropout rate is of people who do not complete the questionnaire. Simply out of boredom, they get fed up, they feel like they're giving their time away for free and there's no benefit to them. So these kinds of completion rates are always a problem. So if you are, in particular, if you're trying to do a study in which you are surveying people or experimenting on the same people in different time periods, say 1 week, 3 months, 6 months, the completion rates in those type of studies are particularly bad, as people need to come back over and over and over again to be tested again and again, and you want to maintain the same people within your sample across time periods, the more likely you are to require a higher sample than you actually need to start with, because the number of people who have dropped out by the end is going to be quite high. So this is a problem in medical research studies and other kinds of studies of that type. And finally, we just have resource constraints. This might be time and money, it might be expertise, it might be just access to facilities in order to contact respondents. So do you have enough phones to contact people by the telephone? So I have put another video on your Wattle site that goes through the different sampling techniques that you have available. So I'm just going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the different types. So we have non-probability versus probability sampling. So probability sampling is all about increasing the generalizability of your results to the population in general. Non-probability sampling tends to be more about accessing certain samples from within a population, particularly if it's difficult to access certain types of people or there's certain characteristics you are looking for. So in terms of convenience, judgment, and judgment sampling, these tend to be more low costs. They tend to be more quicker in their applications. They're often used in things like qualitative methods as well. The same as snowball sampling is often used in qualitative research methods. Quota sampling is also commonly used in marketing research if you are trying to fill certain segments of the markets. So I've done studies when we were looking at the online dating service. We wanted a certain quota of people who are male and female who fulfilled the age requirements. So that is a predetermining that we wanted to talk to people who fulfilled gender characteristics and also age characteristics, because the client knew that these were the people who were using their services, but they used them in quite different ways. And they needed to understand the people on their website more specifically across those different groups. So the probability sampling is, as I said, to increase the generalizability of the sample to the population. So simple random sampling is the most easily understood, basically just taking a random proportion of people from a population. However, it's difficult to construct a sampling frame, it has lower precision, and there's a lot of wasted resources, particularly if you're looking for particular characteristics. So simple random sampling is terrible if you are looking for those left-footed football players born on Mondays. You will spend a long time randomly finding people in a population with those particular characteristics. So systematic sampling can increase representativeness. It can easier to implement, but on the flip side, there's also the possibility of decreasing representativeness based on excluding certain types of people. Stratified sampling, basically it means that you include all important subpopulations. It is precise, but it is difficult, what we call a priori, as in before you start to identify what the relevant stratification variables need to be. And finally, cluster sampling. It's easy to implement, again it's cost effective, but it can be quite imprecise and difficult to compute and interpret the results. So here is a guide to the usual types of sample sizes depending on the type of study. So problem identification research, so market potential, tends to have quite large sample sizes because the population itself tends to be ill-defined. So a minimum is usually 500 respondents, but typical range is 1,000 up to 2,500. Problem-solving research, as in what price should I set? Minimum size is about 200, but the typical range is 300 to 500. Product testing. This can be quite complicated and expensive if you need to get people into a particular location to try the product. So minimum size of 200, typical range 3 to 500. Similar to test marketing studies. However, test marketing studies, as I've talked about previously, when McDonald's uses Adelaide as their test market. So they have a number of stores there where they sell new products that McDonald's is testing, and in follow-up surveys they will focus on people within those Adelaide locations, and they'll try to get about 300 to 500 people responding who have eaten one of those new products at one of those McDonald's stores. Advertising effectiveness surveys, quite small, 150 to 200 to 300. Test market audits, so 10 stores to 10 to 20 stores. So in terms of McDonald's setting up those test markets before the follow-up surveys in the test marketing study, they'll have about 10 stores in Adelaide selling new products or potential new products. And focus groups I've spoke about previously. You wanted at least 2, but usually 6 to 15, with the usual focus group number being around the 10 range. However, just be aware that the size of your sample equals money. So for a lot of these studies, they get done online these days using what's called a panel. And a panel is a paid for, basically a service where you pay for respondents, and these are potential respondents. So a panel vendor will recruit people to be on their panel, and if you've been recruited to one of these panels, you are saying that you are willing to fill in surveys for money, basically. However, in terms of these costs, we're looking at about $10 per respondent. And depending on your panel vendor, that might be per respondent who actually responds versus per respondent who is provided. So the way this works is that you will say to the panel vendor, I want a sample who have of these genders, of this age range, possibly some other characteristics, and I want a final sample of, say, 200, and in order to achieve 200, the panel vendor will send you a panel of, say, 500 possible respondents. So you would contact them, and if you got a minimum of 200, if you don't get your minimum of 200, then it's up to the panel vendor to provide you with more respondents. However, you still have to pay. Each respondent you need to pay, both in incentive, part of that is incentive, and part of that is to the panel vendor themselves as a service provider. So if you're looking at the problem identification research, if you wanted 2,500 people to complete the survey, you're looking at a minimum of $25,000 just to access the sample. So the sampling error, how does this work? So the number of respondents, as it increases, the sampling error decreases. However, this is not a constant line. This is a diminishing return on investment, essentially. So after about between 200 and 400, we start getting towards an acceptable range of error for most marketing studies. So the acceptable range of error is usually about 5% in a lot of marketing studies. But after about 400 to 600, as you see, it drops between 5% and 2%, but the difference between having 1,800 people and having 600 people is rather marginal. It's the difference between 2% error and 4% error, as opposed to having less than 200 people, where you're looking at 10% or more in terms of the error. So in terms of those sample size used in marketing, this is why a lot of them sit around the 200 to 500 range, is because of this acceptable level of error that tends to exist in marketing studies, which is about 5%. So for your project, the sampling questions you need to ask yourself. Should a sample be taken? And by and large, the answer to that question is yes. So then we move on to the other questions. What is the sample frame? So what is the object? What is the time? What is the extent? Those kinds of questions. What type of sampling technique is required? Should it be probabilistic or non-probabilistic? Some of the answers to these questions are going to be determined by the resources that you have. Do we have the resources to actually do a probabilistic sampling? So what is the target final sample size? So what level of sample error is feasible, or are you willing to live with? If that is the final sample size at which you are targeting, how, in terms of the sample frame, how many people should be included or contacted in order to try and get to the target final sample size? Given people drop out of this, the non-starting biases, the non-completion biases, all those sorts of things that happen. And what can be done to control for errors? In doing all of this, there also needs to consider how you're going to recruit respondents for your sampling frame. So are you going to be going through the white pages and phoning people? Are you going to email them? Are you going to be contacting people via social media? How are you, simply put, how is initial contact with potential respondents going to be made? Because that contact method influences the number of people you have access to start with, which then has flow-on effects to the number of people who are likely to complete the instrument. So that was sampling. The next thing I'm going to talk about is questionnaires. So the questionnaire itself is the questions and the items that are asked of respondents. So this is, once they've agreed to participate, whether in a survey or in an experiment, what are they going to be asked to do? So this has implications in terms of design and content of the questionnaire. So in designing your questionnaire, we have 7 steps. As always, you need to confirm the research objectives. What is it that the questionnaire is trying to measure? And the important thing about questionnaires is this is very much about measurement. We need to look at selecting the appropriate data collection method. So this was your survey versus experiment decisions. It also relates to how we're going to collect the data. Is it going to be a telephone survey? Is it going to be an online survey? Is it going to be a mall intercept survey? Because each of those different collection methods influences what and how you should design the questionnaire itself. Step 3 is develop the questions and the scaling. So this is what variables / as in what constructs need to be measured and what items need to be included within measuring those constructs, as in the questions that need to be asked, and on what scale are you going to ask them. Because if you're doing something like a mall intercept questionnaire or data collection method, there needs to be fewer questions, simpler scaling, in order to get someone to spend time with you on the street completing the answers. Whereas if it's a self-completion questionnaire online, the scaling can be more complex and more questions are feasible, and people are more likely to complete. if you have slightly more questions than on a more intercept questionnaire. Step 4, you need to determine the layout and evaluate the questionnaire. Basically, what's going to come first, how are you going to introduce the questionnaire, what instructions need to be provided to the respondent if they are completing the questionnaire by themselves, and basically test it. Do trial testing. Test it once, test it on one person, change it, test it again. This should not be the first questionnaire, should not ever be the one that a respondent sees. We need to obtain the client approval for the questionnaire. This is not something that you will do, this is something that I will do as my role as project coordinator or project manager. Then we pre-test, revise and finalize the questionnaire before we send it out. Again, we test it. And then we implement the questionnaire. So after you have designed your sampling plan and going through the steps of your questionnaire design, developing the questions and scaling is one of the most important steps within this process. So we need to select the appropriate scales. So I discussed this quite extensively in the last lecture, where you need to decide on the constructs or the concepts that you are wanting to test, how you're going to operationalize those constructs into variables that include the items and the measurement scales on which you are going to measure those constructs. In selecting appropriate scales, I highly recommend that you consult your academic literature, because in developing reliable and valid measures of particular constructs is what a lot of academia is about. So in using these academically constructed measurement scales, you can do a questionnaire that is more reliable and more has greater generalizability than if you were to construct your scales from scratch. So after you've decided on what your appropriate scales need to be, you need to present your questions and scales in a logical order. Generally, the rule is that you do the easy, general questions first. So you start with broad concepts, so you might want to start with the product category information first before moving on to more brand specific questions in later parts of the questionnaire. And finally, make sure that you put your demographic and your classification questions at the end. The reason we do this is because if you do have dropouts, the demographic information is often the least necessary of the information, and you can actually conduct analysis that will predict someone's demographic and categorical information based on their answers to other questions. So there are ways around missing demographic information that is not possible with missing answers to the construct questions. So other things to consider in constructing your questionnaire is how long is the questionnaire going to be? And answering this, we need to look at how long will it take to complete. So some of the research that's been done on this question is that 10% of participants basically drop out almost instantaneously. So they click through, they look at the first question and they say nope and drop out. After that, you'll get about a 2% dropout rate for every 100 survey items. And by survey items, I mean questions. And this study was done on online surveys. So other types of survey types, the dropout rate can actually be higher. So a general rule of thumb is that 10 minutes is about the absolute max that you'd like to do for a survey, but after about 7 minutes, the dropout rates increase rapidly. So in terms of the layout of your questionnaire, So confirm the research objectives before starting. Always, this is our starting point for everything. What data do you require in order to answer your research objectives or meet your research objectives? So, do you need categorical data? Do you need ratio data? Do you need interval data in order to be able to conduct the appropriate analysis required to answer a question? As I mentioned last week, you can convert more complex types of measurement scales, so your interval and ratio scales can be converted into categorical and ordinal scales, but the opposite is not true. And in terms of using the right type of scale, for instance, in order to run a regression analysis, you need interval or ratio data. You cannot run a regression analysis on categorical data. So, if you need to test the causal relationship between two constructs, you need to measure those two constructs on interval or ratio scales. The introduction section should include a general description of the study. It should also include reasons why the participant should participate. Basically, of what value is the research going to be for the respondent themselves? If people see some sense of self-interest in giving their time to completing a questionnaire, they are more likely to start the questionnaire and also complete the questionnaire. There should be instructions to respondents or interviewers on how to complete the questionnaire and particular questions. So if you're using measurement scales, you can provide examples of how the measurement scale should be completed. Questions and scale measurements should follow a logical order. So this is a logic for the respondent, not necessarily the researcher. So pre-testing the questionnaire with a potential respondent is the best way to determine this. So we start with the simple questions, then get to the more difficult ones and the more specific ones. Put your personal questions and your demographics at the end of the survey, and include psychological topics, things like lifestyle beliefs, attitudes, towards the end of the interview but before the demographics. Avoid asking questions using the same measurement format for everything. This reduces respondent fatigue and also makes sure that they are actually thinking about their responses rather than simply, if you give them a scale of 1 to 7, they can sit there and go 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, right down the survey, irrespective of the question being asked. And the interview or survey needs to be finished with a thank you statement and possibly and a huge thank you and an offer for them to contact the researcher if they have any questions. So evaluating your questionnaire, the first step is test it. The second step is test it again. Then check that there are items to measure all constructs and research questions, and then test it again. So, the supplements that go along with a questionnaire. The supplements that are required are dependent on the data collection method you have chosen, and also whether you are doing a survey or a experiment. So it doesn't matter if you're doing a survey or an experiment, the cover letter is essentially your request to participate. So it introduces the respondent to the research project. It informs the respondent of the importance of the study, particularly the importance of the study to the respondent. So this idea of personal investment in the study. And it communicates the study's legitimacy and the deadlines that are required. In marketing research, these cover letters need to be engaging. You might need to have it saying win a prize in big letters, and then all the nuts and bolts of the survey being in small font. So this idea that we need to get people's attention first in order for them to at least click through or at least open up the survey in order to have any potential for them completing the survey. So here are some examples of some cover letters that I have used in the past. These are determined by these cover letters are part of the ANU's formatting requirements for academic research. I've provided a link to these on Wattle for you to see the kind of information that is required in a cover letter. My great big criticism of the ANU cover letter format and also my own use of these cover letters is that they're very much not engaging to respondents. So it's very hard for a potential respondent to easily see what this research is about and why it would be of interest to them to participate. For example, this is another cover letter I did of a survey of Brumbies supporters. Basically, I had a prize of $100 of Brumbies merchandise to encourage participation. However, that information is buried very much in the middle of a paragraph. Whereas I would suggest that if you're going to offer this kind of prize, it should be in big letters at the top. Instead of my address, it should be win $100 worth of Brumbies merchandise. So, like I said, these are more academically focused, so they're not necessarily the best formatted. So, other questionnaire supplement documents, these ones relate much more towards survey kind of research, and your textbook covers them in a lot more detail than I'm going to refer to them. So, in doing a survey, you might need supervisor instructions. So this is the person in charge of doing the data collection or overseeing a team of people doing the data collection. So who is going to do what, in what order should it be done, and what kind of validity or error checking is required by the supervisor over their team of data collectors. The interviewer instructions relate to if you're going to, instead of doing self-completion surveys, you're going to get maybe a telephone survey interview or a more intercept interview where someone is going to ask the respondent the questions. So the instructions might include what should be the opening lines, how should the measurement scale be asked of the respondent, because should answering 100 questions, should the measurement scale be repeated for every question. Screening forms, so the idea of ascertaining who is eligible to complete a survey because they fit a certain criteria. Quota sheets, basically counting the amount of respondents who fit, males 18 to 25, females 35 to 45, these kind of quotas that might be needed in the sampling frame. Rating cards can be used if a scale is being used over and over and over again, so the respondent knows that all they have to do is hold up a particular score in answering a question. And call record sheets. If you are doing a telephone interview, how will calls to potential respondents be logged, and how will the difference between respondents versus non-respondents be tabled? Because this is important information to report, because it shows whether non-respondent bias might be an issue or a limitation of the data collected. So, if you are doing an experiment, on the other hand, this is not covered in your textbook so much. So a lot of these documents or supplements that are appropriate for surveys may also apply to the experiment, depending on how the experiment is being run. You can run experiments as an online survey, for instance. However, experiments themselves require a protocol. This is the specific plan of how the experiment and the manipulations of conditions will be affected in practice. So, if you are doing research task 3, you need to, and your project has decided to do an experimental method, you will need to include an experiment protocol in your submission. So, the experiment protocol itself requires you to specify the sample plan. So this is on top of the sample frame that you create in terms of identifying eligible participants. Within an experiment, you need to assign participants to what we call sample groups or experimental groups. So these are ideally, participants are assigned randomly to the different conditions or manipulations that are required within the experiment. And these sample groups should include 2 different types of groups, a control group and a test group. So a control group in medical research is the group that's given the placebo. Basically, they are given a non-treatment in order to identify whether it is feeling like they're being treated that is having the effect, or whether it's the actual medication that is having the effect. So this is part of increasing the internal validity of the study. However, some types of experiments, it makes no sense to have a control group because there's no such thing as the null condition, is what we call it, basically. So in a taste test experiment, there is no control for not having someone taste something. So the next thing that we decided is what are the manipulations, also known as the conditions in which these groups will be assigned. So specifically, this is how is the independent variable going to be manipulated for each group. So this could be the amount of information shown, this could be the type of information shown, this could be the product that is actually tested, or it could also be the order in which products are tested. The reason we change the order in which products are tested is that taste can have interactive effects. So if you eat something sweet to begin with, it makes everything you eat after it or taste after it taste more dull. So you tend to, if you start with sweet all the time, that confounding effect might influence how people rate the follow-up or the second and third things that they taste. You also need a design plan. When is this experiment going to take place? Where is it going to take place? And how is it going to take place? So how are you going to assign respondents to a group when they arrive? How are you going to manage the conditions within your manipulation groups or your experimental groups? So how are you going to make sure, if someone has been assigned to the control group, how are you going to make sure that that person only receives the placebo manipulation rather than the actual test manipulation? We then conduct an experiment, but we also need a plan for how to input the raw data into an analyzable format. So if we have respondents that are in control groups and test groups, how is the respondents' allocation to those groups going to be documented into the data set, into our SPSS or PSPP data file, so therefore we can determine who or which respondent was in which condition, and therefore run the analysis on differences or relationships between those two test conditions. So in summary, this video has dealt with sampling, going from the population to a sample frame to actual sampling of people in practice. I've talked about questionnaire design, where we start from general questions to specific questions of interest around constructs and ending in demographic questions. And finally, I talked about the supplements that go along with these questionnaires. These depend on which quantitative method you are using and the data collection method that has been chosen. From here we move on to consider how do we then deal with managing the data once it's been collected. So between the now and next time we start doing the data collection and start dealing with actual data.